Hello, class. Welcome to um, REL 150. This is lecture six, actually week seven, but the sixth lecture. So we have this week, and then we have two more lectures the next 2 weeks, followed by our final exam in um, 3 weeks. So hopefully you'll be all be ready for that. So keep in mind any of the assignments that you have not done, please go ahead and get caught up on those and get those to me. Keep in mind also the you have the term paper as well as the final exam. If you have any questions about that, feel free to let me know. I'll answer your questions as soon as I can. Um, I'd encourage you to go ahead and start working on that. The earlier the better. You have till the final week, but if you can do it earlier, then that saves the pressure that might build up for the final week if you have all that still over your head at that time. Okay, so we are we've been talking about Paul. We'll continue with him this evening, the mission trips in the book of Acts, and also cover his letters. So we'll be doing that and working our way through the rest of the New Testament. Hope you're enjoying this class so far and learning a lot of things, regardless of your backgrounds. If you are from a Christian background, hopefully you're learning some new things about the Bible or things you may not have known before. And of course, if you are new to, if you have not been exposed to Christianity or not read the Bible, hopefully you are learning some of the main themes, main points, and hopefully you are enjoying the process. Again, the goal is not to convert you. I do respect that this is a Buddhist school, and also that I respect your background, whatever that may be, whether you are Buddhist or Christian or um, some other religion or even no religion. I do want to respect your backgrounds, but also do want to at least um, teach you or inform you of just some of the basic aspects of New Testament, which is from a Christian perspective, obviously. Okay, so let me open the notes for today, and I meant to change this part to L150. Um, we'll say lecture instead of lesson. And here we'll say New Testament survey lecture six. So today, in the sixth lecture, we will be covering chapter 16 of the textbook, which is the Pauline program, or we could say the Pauline mission. This will cover the book of Acts, chapter 15, or 1536 through 21:16. This gets us most of the way through the book of Acts, but not quite. So we'll have next couple of weeks to probably finish it actually the next week, if I remember correctly. There are a few more books after Acts and after Paul's letters that we need to discuss, but we'll pick this up today, or we'll cover these chapters at least for today. All right, so after the close of the Council of Jerusalem, Paul and Barnabas returned to Antioch and spent some time teaching and preaching. Most likely, careful instruction was needed to clarify the confusion over the question of circumcision. So hopefully you get the idea of what circumcision means. That is a medical practice specifically for males, cutting the foreskin off the male reproductive organ. And that has been practiced not only by Jews, but especially by Jews. It's most associated with Jews. And in the Old Testament, it was a sort of a rite or a practice for all Jewish males to undergo that shortly after their birth. Or for anyone that converted to Judaism, they had to, any male that underwent conversion and became a Jew, um, had to undergo that practice. So that's a big reason why in New Testament times you have all these men that are God-fearers, these um, Gentile men, Greek and Roman men, that were attracted to the Jewish faith but did not become full converts because they did not want to undergo that practice. That practice was obviously a painful procedure, but also a full conversion to Jewish culture as well as to the Jewish religion. So, and that's what we're seeing is that these God-fearers, these Gentile men, were more easily attracted to Christianity, and that's why this was such a big controversy, and why it was such a relief for them when the council at Jerusalem, or the first church council we talked about last week, decided that Gentile converts did not have to be circumcised when they chose to follow Christ. So they could follow Christ and in that way incorporate themselves to worshiping the Jewish gods that's expressed through Christ, or that uh, or as revealed in Christ would be the best way to put that, but not actually convert culturally to becoming fully Jewish in culture. Okay, so later, so after Paul and Barnabas had been back in Antioch teaching about what happened with this council and clarifying this issue of circumcision, then later Paul suggested a new mission, showing that his leadership was an established fact. In other words, as we saw in the beginning chapters, the early part of their mission trip, that Barnabas was named first, and he was the main leader, but eventually Paul became more important, and he was named first. So now Paul is the bigger leader than Barnabas in this case. And then from this point on in the book of Acts and throughout the New Testament as well. So Paul felt that the evangelization or spreading the gospel achieved in the former mission needed to be solidified through instruction and organization of the new converts to Christianity. Unfortunately, a dispute arose between Barnabas and Paul that, for the time being, ended their partnership. Barnabas wanted to take again John Mark, giving him a second chance, given that his service had been unsatisfactory. You may remember that he abandoned them during the previous mission trip. For whatever reason, he was with them for the first part of the trip, but eventually maybe things were too hard for him, so he wanted to go back home, and he left them. But now he wants to come along again. And Barnabas is known for his encouragement and his compassion. So he says, yes, he wants to take along John Mark. Paul is more committed to the mission and was not happy with that John Mark had deserted them. And he thinks the mission is too important, more important than giving John Mark a second chance. So he says, no, I don't want to take John Mark. So they split ways. So again, Paul felt that taking John Mark was a bad risk, given the seriousness of the task they were about to undertake. Barnabas took John Mark with them to Cyprus. Paul chose Silas and headed north through Syria and Cilicia toward Asia Minor. At this point, Barnabas disappears from the narrative of Acts, though Paul remained in contact with him and mentioned him in his writings as still being engaged in the work of the Lord. So it's unfortunate that these two great men or great Christian leaders had this sort of debate and division, but it still served God's purposes. And by going their separate ways, they both undertook missions and increased the spread of the gospel. And ultimately, they were still, we can say, in partnership, or they were still colleagues in doing the Lord's work. They just didn't work as closely together. And because they were both working in different places, the gospel spreads in these diverse locations more quickly than if they had stayed together as a team and only gone on one mission trip together. All right, so let's turn to the second mission to Asia Minor. The expedition set out on its journey in 49 AD After the interval of teaching in Antioch, they traveled by land through Syria and Cilicia, confirming and solidifying the faith and work of the churches earlier established. Eventually, they reached Derbe and Lystra, which had been the last outposts of their previous tour. Here, Paul found a young convert named Timothy, whose mother was Jewish and father was Greek. So he was half Jewish, at least in ethnically speaking, um, but we would say fully Jewish in terms of his faith. Timothy had been thoroughly trained in the Old Testament scriptures by his Jewish mother and grandmother, and was highly regarded by the Christians in the region. Recognizing Timothy as a potential leader and a valuable assistant for work in that territory, Paul added him to the company. However, the status of Timothy posed a new problem for Paul. As the son of a Gentile father and um, being uncircumcised, Timothy might be rejected by the Jewish population, who had already proved hostile to Paul and his message. On the other hand, if Paul had him circumcised, he would seemingly be making a concession to the Judaizers who had already plagued Galatia and whose position Paul had already attacked in his epistle, and the action would also seem inconsistent with the results of the Jerusalem Council and all that Paul had contended for. So, sort of a dilemma. Should Paul circumcise Timothy or not? Well, Paul decided to have Timothy circumcised as a concession that removed an obstacle for further work among the Jews of the region. Since Timothy could be considered a Jew rather than a Gentile by undergoing circumcision, and because of his heritage, the action did not repudiate the principle that Gentiles did not need to submit to the law. So this was not a case of Timothy being a Gentile and Paul circumcising him to make him culturally a Jew in order to follow Christ, but this was a case of Timothy was half Jewish, and but he would be considered more or less a Jew if Paul had him circumcised, and that way he would fit in with the Jews better, culturally speaking. So it was not about his faith; it was just a decision, a practical decision regarding fitting in. So in terms of the culture, all right, almost like learning the language as missionaries do when they go to different cultures. So apparently, the epistle and the personal visit of Paul brought peace to the Galatian churches. Having completed the visitation of Galatia, Paul looked for new areas to enter. He preached along the western border of Galatia, which was Phrygian in nationality, as he proceeded along the road toward Asia. Prohibited from entering other areas, he made his way to Troas, the westernmost part of Asia, wondering what his next move should be. So now we turn to the mission to Macedonia. Two important events occurred at Troas. First, a vision of a Macedonian man pleading for help appeared to Paul. Paul accepted this vision as the call of God, which eventually led to the evangelization of Europe and the effect of the gospel on Western civilization. So Paul could have gone east or west. He went west, and that led to spreading Christianity more to Europe at the time. Maybe if he had gone east, maybe it would have reached the rest of Asia and then even into China much earlier than it did, historically speaking. But the West was, at this time, we would say, because of the Roman rule and the more united society overall, the West was in a better place to receive the gospel, and obviously the roads, the infrastructure, the language, and all that united the Western culture, made that a much better place, or much more suitable place to for the Christian message to spread and take root, and then eventually spread to the rest of the world. Second, at Troas, Paul was joined by Luke, the missionary journalist and writer of the book of Acts, or Luke and Acts. So this is the traditional view, is that this physician named Luke was the one that wrote these books. So the author of Acts begins to write "we" in the narrative at this point, indicating he was a participant in the action. So before this, you see Paul described in the third person. He or his team was they, but now the author begins to write "we," which makes it seem like he is part of the team at this point. Okay, now we turn to Philippi. Leaving Troas, Paul and his company crossed the Aegean Sea to Neapolis in Macedonia, the seaport of Philippi. Philippi was the leading city of its district and was a Roman colony, and thus its inhabitants were citizens of Rome. Since there was no large colony of Jews in Philippi, there was no synagogue where Paul could begin his preaching. A small prayer meeting outside the city by the river was the only center of Jewish faith that he could find. Lydia, a Thyatiran dealer in dyed goods and textiles, and a proselyte, opened her home to him as his headquarters. During his ministry in the city, he expelled a demon from a slave girl, a clairvoyant who had been a source of wealth to her masters. In other words, she sort of knew things supernaturally. She knew about Paul and what he was doing. And so actually she advertised for him essentially, but obviously by having an evil spirit, she wasn't, the evil spirit wasn't necessarily trying to promote Paul, but the evil spirits couldn't help but speak about him when he was there. And so it seems that this clairvoyant girl had been able to make money for her masters by knowing things supernaturally, like a psychic type of person. So they exploited that talent to make money. But now, without the demon that was cast out, then she could no longer do that. So, angered by the loss of their business, the masters, accused Paul and Silas of teaching customs that were unlawful for Romans. This appeal to political prejudices resulted in the imprisonment and beating of Paul and Silas, who were released from jail by an earthquake. It seems like a supernatural event that God caused in order to free them. But their claim of Roman citizenship exempted them from further punishment. But their ministry in Philippi was ended, and they left for other fields. The "we" sections ended at this point, or ended for the moment at this point, suggesting that Luke remained in Philippi, perhaps to act as pastor for the new church and to serve as an evangelist for Macedonia. Next, we have Thessalonica. Traveling along the Egnatian highway from Philippi, Paul and his companions passed through Amphipolis on the way to Thessalonica, also known as Thessaloniki or Salonika. The Jewish colony in Thessalonica had a synagogue where Paul preached for 3 weeks. Luke defined briefly the type of message that Paul gave to men of Jewish background. The major premise was that the Messiah of the Scriptures must die and rise again from the dead. The minor premise was that Jesus of Nazareth matched the prophetic description and should be identified with the Messiah. There should be a sharp difference of opinion followed. Let me correct that. So with some of the Jews believing, as well as a great response among the proselyte Greeks. However, the majority of the Jews rejected his message, and their opposition became so intense that the evangelists, meaning Paul and his companions, could not remain in the city. They fled by night to Berea, where they again began preaching in the synagogue. Now we turn to Berea. The visit to Berea was more peaceful than that in Thessalonica. The Jews received Paul's message and diligently examined the scriptures to see whether or not he was telling the truth. Believers were multiplying when a delegation from Thessalonica arrived and commenced to attack Paul. Realizing that should be nothing could be done, the believers sent Paul on his way. Paul turned south and went to Athens, where he was beyond the reach of the Jews. In spite of persecution, the Thessalonian church flourished, as seen through Paul's letters, the letters to the Thessalonians. When Paul left Berea, Silas and Timothy remained behind to complete the work that he could not finish. Paul did not see his helpers again until they joined him later at Corinth. So now let's examine the Thessalonian letters. Again, there are two letters in the New Testament, First and Second Thessalonians. They are towards the end, not too far from the back of the inside of the New Testament. Among Paul's letters, they are very close to his final letters in the order, but in terms of chronologically, when he wrote the letters, they were some of the first ones. Let's look first at First Thessalonians. First, we'll look at the content. Although these letters belong chronologically to Paul's stay in Corinth around 51, they bear relation to the church he helped start in Thessalonica. They were written within a few months of each other while Paul was engaged in the ministry of Achaia. The first letter was written to praise the steadfastness of the Thessalonians under persecution by the Jews and to correct certain errors and misunderstandings that had developed among them. The main doctrinal theme concerned the return of Christ. The Thessalonian epistles contain the earliest full discussion of this truth in Christian literature. Let's look at the evaluation. The problems in this epistle, in general, reflect the problems of Gentile converts, including moral issues such as sexual relations and idleness, which would not have been issues for Jews. The teaching of Christ's return was not entirely new, since Paul seems to have taught them in person about the subject, and he may have known of the teachings of Christ on this subject. The discussion begins with the translation of the living into immortal life. So those that are still alive in the end times, they have to be transformed from being mortal into immortal. And then the resurrection of the dead. In response to the desire to know when Christ would return, Paul replies that being alert and active while waiting for Christ's coming is more important than speculation of the time. All right, next we turn to Second Thessalonians. We'll look first at the content. The second epistle to the Thessalonians was written to remove the misunderstanding that the final day is immediate. It is possible that Thessalonians had misunderstood the previous teaching or writing of Paul, given the sense of urgency and passion he seems to have conveyed, or else they had received teaching from a more questionable source, meaning someone deceived them, and maybe even made them think that the end time had already come and they missed it. So Paul sought to provide them with definite criteria by which they might recognize the coming of Christ. Unfortunately, though these criteria may have been clear within the context of Paul's writing, they are not easy to understand today. Apparently, three major events will occur before the Lord's coming. A sudden acceleration of falling away from godliness, the removal of a restraining influence, and the revealing of the incarnation of evil who will oppose and exalt himself against God. We usually call that person the Antichrist. Paul then continues the exhortation for the people to work, mind their business, and earn their living, rather than depending on others in order to focus on the return of Jesus. So it seems like some were just so ready for Jesus to come back and waiting for him that they had stopped working and just sat around waiting. And obviously, that was not a mature thing to do. They still needed to be responsible people and work for a living. And Paul had to encourage them to do that. Let's look at the evaluation. The epistles to the Thessalonians are among the first of Paul's writings, and they show that the message of Paul had already been a settled body of faith for some time, which included a rule of conduct. The tradition was authentic and authoritative. Paul had a right to his authority if his message had been received from God and was given through him by the Holy Spirit. These two small epistles reveal nearly every doctrine of the Christian faith, and they contain a well-rounded body of theological teaching. Paul and those who received his epistles believed in one God, the Father, who has chosen humans to enjoy his salvation, sending them deliverance from wrath through Jesus Christ, his Son, and revealing them this message through the gospel, confirmed and made real through the power of the Holy Spirit. Jesus was killed by the Jews, rose again, is now in heaven, and will come again. To him is ascribed deity. He is the Lord and God's Son. Believers are to receive the word of God, turn from idols, and serve God, waiting for the return of Christ and growing in faith and a holy lifestyle. All right, now we turn to the mission to Achaia, starting with Athens. The city of Athens was one of the wonders of the ancient world. In the time of Paul, it is political and commercial importance, or its uh, political and commercial importance had declined greatly from its golden age in the 5th century BC, but it still retained something of its intellectual and cultural atmosphere. The people of Athens were deeply conscious of their heritage and prided themselves on their past. The intellectual atmosphere of the city preserved the philosophical tradition, and the teachers who frequented the public arena at least showed an appreciation of past thinkers such as Plato and Aristotle, even if they lacked the same creative genius. While Paul was awaiting at Athens the arrival of Silas and Timothy from Macedonia, he gave himself, as usual, to the ministry. He was active in the synagogue, where he met the usual congregation of Jews and proselytes, and in the marketplace, where he encountered pagan, meaning non-Jewish or non-Christian thinkers. So those with more of a Greek and Roman background, possibly believing in Greek and Roman gods still, or maybe at this point, not really having much faith in any type of religion. So here he met a new type of opponent, the educated and cynical pagan who was ready to hear anything but not ready to believe it. Paul's preaching intrigued their curiosity, and they took him to the Areopagus for a hearing. The Areopagus was Mars Hill, a small rock elevation in Athens where there was an area large enough for a public conference. Here he made an official statement of the chief tenets of his teaching. His speech, which is recorded in Acts chapter 17, was a masterpiece of condensation, or condensing the main points of Christian gospel and adapting it to that context, uh, to this Gentile or Greco-Roman context. So beginning with the point of contact furnished by the lavish display of architecture and statues that adorned the city, most of which was dedicated to the worship of the gods, meaning the old Greek and Roman gods. He made a plea for the one God, the one true Jewish God, who made the heavens and earth and who governs the destinies of men. So in contrast to the popular philosophies of Epicureanism and Stoicism, Paul spoke of God as immanent, meaning God is with us, not God is far distant. So emphasizing his personality as well as the need for repentance. For most Greeks who considered the body inferior to the soul, Paul's reference to resurrection, uh, meaning that the body will rise from the dead, so that was not regarded as credible. They did not believe that. Following his speech, there were some, though few, converts. Apparently, the ministry in Athens was a disappointment to Paul. He created no stir in the synagogue, and the pagan population dismissed him with ridicule. The response seemed to dishearten Paul and caused him to rethink his procedure for presenting and defending the gospel. Now we turn to Corinth. From Athens, Paul went to Corinth, a city that was much different. After being sacked and burned by the Romans, it was later rebuilt by Julius Caesar and became the acknowledged political capital of Achaia, a senatorial province. Corinth was the residence of the governing proconsul. Located on the peninsula that connected the Peloponnesus to the mainland, Corinth became a center of trade. Many shipmasters preferred to transport their cargoes to Corinth and then send them westward to the Adriatic ports of Italy. With its two seaports, Corinth gained a monopoly of trade and rapidly grew wealthy. Corinth was a Roman colony. Like Philippi, its population was cosmopolitan, with a new population settling it after its first inhabitants were killed or displaced when the Romans first destroyed it. Jews came for trade, Romans came for official business, and Greeks came toward the city from the countryside. Commerce also brought sailors, bankers, and others from all over the Mediterranean world. Rapid growth and wealth promoted a false culture. Corinth became a boom town offering luxury and sport. Corinthians were deemed morally inferior, even by the loose standards of pagan Greco Roman culture, and their manner of life was considered the vilest. The priestesses of the temple of Aphrodite were professional prostitutes, and commerce brought the lowest elements of Mediterranean society. So, thus, Corinth contained both beauty and wretchedness. Paul's arrival at Corinth may be dated in the fall of the same year he left Macedonia. His total stay in Corinth was a year and a half. Perhaps the most acceptable dating would have Paul arriving in Corinth in the fall of 51 AD and departing in the early spring of 53 AD. The scorn with which his message was greeted at Athens brought him to Corinth in a depressed frame of mind. His colleagues had not returned from Macedonia, and his funds were probably running short. When he reached Corinth, he found employment at his old trade of tent making with Aquila and Priscilla. In a short time, Silas and Timothy returned from Macedonia, bringing the good news of the growth of the churches. He may have received the generous contribution from the Macedonian churches at this time. Encouraged, he preached more vigorously that Jesus was the Messiah. The reaction Paul faced in the synagogue caused him to withdraw, vowing that he would leave the Jews to their unbelief and go to the Gentiles. He transferred his headquarters to the home of a proselyte, Titus Justus, who lived nearby. Many Corinthians believed and were baptized. Paul's ministry in Corinth at this time seems to have been under considerable strain. He reorganized his missionary procedure. The 18 months of his pioneer work in this corrupt and idolatrous city must have taken a heavy toll on his physical and nervous strength. In company with Aquila and Priscilla, Paul left Corinth and set out for the east. They stopped at Ephesus on the way, where Aquila and Priscilla took up new headquarters and began their ministry. Paul preached in the synagogue for a short time before parting for Palestine. There are no details given of his journey. He landed in Caesarea, greeted the church either at Caesarea or Jerusalem, and then proceeded to Antioch. He may have spent late summer and early fall in the tour of Galatia and Phrygia. The disturbance in the Galatian churches that began at the time of the council around 48 or 49 AD may not have died down completely, and thus Paul had to strengthen the disciples. Before winter set in, Paul was back at Ephesus. It was perhaps the longest and most volatile ministry of his experience. All right, we'll turn now to the ministry to Asia, starting with Ephesus. The city of Ephesus was one of the oldest settlements on the west coast of Asia Minor and the leading city of the Roman province of Asia. It was a prominent settlement in the 8th century BC and was taken over by the Greeks at an early date. Roads from Ephesus communicated with all the other large cities of the province and with the lines of commerce that connected with the north and east. It was a strategic point for evangelism, since workers from Ephesus could maintain contact with the whole Asian vicinity. The outstanding feature of Ephesus was its great temple of Artemis, a local deity who was later identified with Artemis of the Greeks and with Diana of the Romans. The first temple was burned to the ground in 356 BC and replaced by a newer and larger structure. It was considered one of the wonders of the world and was an outstanding center for pilgrims who came to worship at this shrine. And because its halls and grounds were regarded as sacred and inviolable, it also became an asylum for the oppressed and a depository for funds. A crude picture of the temple appeared on Ephesian coins, accompanied by the title used for the city, Neokoros, or Temple Sweeper of Artemis. The inhabitants of Asia and of Ephesus in particular exhibited an almost fanatical devotion to Artemis, as seen in the account of the mob in the amphitheater, which for 2 hours shouted, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." Okay, let's take a break and we'll continue the lecture shortly.